The last stand of the samurai, they knew the world had already changed. Yet they chose to face it with swords drawn. 1877 A.D., the Battle of Shiroyama. A few hundred samurai, their armor battered and their code fading into myth, stand atop a mist-shrouded hill overlooking Kagoshima. Below them waits an army of 30,000 imperial troops, rifles, artillery, and the new face of Japan. The old way of the warrior stands against the future itself. A cold wind sweeps through the pine trees. Lanterns flicker. Saigo Takamori, the man once hailed as the last samurai, stares into the valley, knowing he will never see another sunrise. Yet he stands unshaken, eyes reflecting both grief and fire. Most people never knew this. The samurai were surrounded on all sides. Their food was gone, ammunition nearly spent. Still, they smiled when they heard the cannons begin to roll uphill. Because they had made their choice, and just before dawn, a messenger rode through the rain with Saigo's final command, 9 words that would echo through eternity. What he said that night changed everything. The storm above Kagoshima, the wind carried the scent of rain, blood, and pine resin. It was the kind of night when even the mountains seemed to hold their breath. Kagoshima lay in uneasy sleep below, its streets empty, its people hiding behind paper doors as thunder murmured above the sea. On the ridge of Shiroyama, 600 samurai prepared for their final dawn. Saigō Takamori stood apart from them, his silhouette etched against the dim glow of the horizon. Once he had been a general of the Imperial Army, a man who helped forge the new Japan. But now he stood on the other side of history, facing the very empire he had helped to build. Fate, it seemed, loved its cruel ironies. In the distance, cannon fire cracked. The mountain echoed like a heartbeat. The imperial lines were tightening, every hour brought fresh troops, and the circle around Shiroyama grew smaller. Yet Saigo did not retreat. He could not. To him, surrender was a word unworthy of breath. A lieutenant approached, bowing low. "The men are ready, Segedano. We will hold the ridge till sunrise." Saigo nodded, his voice calm but heavy. "Then let them see how the old world dies." Lightning flared across the sky, turning armor plates into mirrors. The samurai tightened their bindings, checked the edges of their blades. Some whispered prayers. Others smiled faintly, not in madness, but in acceptance. For them, death was not defeat. It was proof of loyalty, but fate had something else planned. From the valley below, drums began to thunder. The imperial troops, tens of thousands strong, were moving. Lines of riflemen advanced through the rain, guided by the pale flicker of lanterns. Behind them came the new weapons of war: field guns, Gatling batteries. The metallic scream of modernization. A messenger stumbled through the mud, breathless. "They've breached the southern slope." Saigo's eyes narrowed. "Let them climb," he said quietly. "The mountain will judge their courage." His officers exchanged glances, half awe, half fear. No man could stand against such odds. Yet Saigo had not gathered his followers for victory. He had gathered them for remembrance, for a final act that would burn their names into the memory of a nation. When the first shells exploded along the ridge, the forest erupted into chaos. Branches snapped, smoke thickened, and fire tore through the night. The samurai did not scatter. They moved as one, silent shadows darting between flame and fog. Steel met fire. A young warrior named Ijichi led the first countercharge, his katana flashing like a silver streak through gun smoke. He cut down 3 soldiers before the 4th shot him point blank. He fell with a smile, not of joy, but relief. Around him, the air shook with bullets and thunder. And yet, amidst the storm, a strange calm settled over Saigo. He watched the flashes in the valley, the lightning of a new age consuming the old. "This," he whispered, is the price of forgetting our soul. But what happened next, no historian expected. As dawn neared, Imperial troops paused their bombardment. The rain had softened the ground, and the cannons were being dragged uphill for a final assault. Saigo ordered his men to rest, not sleep, just stillness. In that brief silence, they sharpened their blades, cleaned their wounds, and recited verses from memory. One man began to hum an old Satsuma melody, a song once sung in victory. The tune spread quietly through the camp. Even as shells fell closer, the melody continued, rising above the smoke like a ghost. Soldiers on the lower slopes would later swear they heard it too, faint, defiant, unbroken. Then the messenger arrived, mud-caked, bleeding, carrying Saigo's seal. He bowed low and handed over a parchment. The general opened it, read in silence. And for the first time that night, his expression softened. He turned to his officers. "At sunrise," he said, "we go down the mountain." Murmurs rippled through the ranks. Down, into the fire. "Yes," Saigo continued. "We are no longer defenders. We are the storm itself." His men understood. If they must die, they would die moving forward, not waiting for death to find them. The first rays of light pierced the clouds. The valley shimmered with muskets, bayonets, and banners. The Imperial Army stood ready, confident that the samurai would soon be erased from the earth. And then they saw movement. Out of the smoke came figures. Dozens, then hundreds, descending the slope in perfect formation. Swords gleamed. Voices roared. The last samurai were charging straight into the guns of the future. The Imperial lines opened fire. The hill shook. Men fell, rose again, and kept running. Every step closed the distance between centuries. The feudal and the modern colliding in a heartbeat of chaos. But here's the shocking truth. For a moment, it worked. The sheer ferocity of the charge broke through the first line. Riflemen stumbled back. Artillery crews panicked. The impossible was happening, the ancient code cutting through the modern age. And yet, victory was not what they sought. It was remembrance as smoke and screams filled the air. Saigo's lieutenant looked back once, seeing the sun rising behind the ridge. "It's beautiful," he said softly, moments before the second volley tore through them. When the guns fell silent, only the wind answered that the samurai had vanished into the smoke, swallowed by the battlefield. None knew if Saigo still lived or if he had already become legend. But the Imperial commander, staring up the mountain, murmured to his aide, "They're not running. They're coming back." He was right. The second charge was already forming in the fog. And what they carried this time would change the fate of every man still standing on that mountain. Steel against lightning, the dawn of September 24, 1877, bled crimson over Shiroyama. Smoke hung heavy, curling around the blackened trees, the smell of powder clinging to the wet earth. Down in the valley, the Imperial troops adjusted their bayonets and checked their rifles. The rhythmic click of metal echoing like a dirge. Above them, the last samurai, fewer than 500 now, stood poised on the ridge, framed by the rising sun. For a fleeting second, it was beautiful. Then the earth shook. Imperial artillery roared. Fire streaked across the sky, crashing into the slope where Saigo's men waited. Whole sections of hillside erupted, the mountain bleeding stone and ash. The world was thunder and flame, but through that inferno, the samurai moved. They emerged from smoke and chaos, cutting through confusion with eerie precision. Ghosts made flesh. Their armor glistened with rain and blood. The Imperial lines reeled. Muskets fired, reloaded, fired again. But the samurai closed the distance like a tide. Steel met lightning. Katanas flashed, bayonets clashed, men screamed. and history bent beneath the weight of both courage and futility. Saigo himself led the front, his sword carving arcs through riflemen who had never before faced a man so close. He fought not as a general, but as the embodiment of everything being erased that morning. Behind him, his banner white silk with the black crest of Satsuma whipped in the wind, tattered but unbroken. But here's the shocking truth. The narrator would whisper if this were a tale told in flickering light. For nearly 10 minutes, the samurai pushed them back. 10 minutes. That was all. It was enough to make the emperor's soldiers falter. Enough for the myth to breathe one last time. Then the Gatling guns began to turn. Their barrels spun like a curse, spitting fire and lead into the heart of the charge. Men fell where they stood, armor shredded, swords broken in mid-swing. The sound was mechanical, merciless, a storm of progress tearing through flesh and memory. And yet Saigo did not retreat. He turned once. Seeing his friend Beppu Shinsuke rallying the survivors, their eyes met a silent understanding between warriors born of the same soil, now standing at the edge of extinction. Beppu lifted his sword, shouting above the thunder, "Takamori dono." For Satsuma. Saigo nodded, voice calm amid the chaos. For honor, Beppu. Always for honor. The next blast sent them scattering behind shattered earthworks. The ridge was collapsing. The Imperial line was climbing. Each meter lost was a wound to the soul of the samurai. By mid-morning, the hill was a graveyard. Smoke blurred the line between the living and the dead. The few who still stood fought knee-deep in mud, using broken spears, even stones. Every shot, every swing, was slower now, not from fear, but exhaustion. But fate had one more twist. A sudden silence fell. The guns stopped. Even the wind paused. Out of the haze, a single Imperial officer approached under a white flag. His boots sank into the mud as he neared Saigo's position. "General Takamori," he called, voice trembling but loud enough to carry. "His Majesty commands you to surrender. End this tragedy, and your men will be spared." The samurai looked to Saigo. The world seemed to hold its breath. Saigo's expression did not change. He raised his sword slightly, the blade catching the dim light, and said, "If the emperor wishes to end tragedy, let him end injustice." Then he lowered the sword and turned his back. The officer stood frozen for a moment, then retreated, wordless. Within minutes, the bombardment resumed harder, faster, as though the mountain itself were being erased from the map, and still. The samurai held. They fought through fire and smoke, through screams and collapsing trenches. Their numbers thinned to a handful, but every fall was answered with another charge. The Imperial soldiers, armed with repeating rifles, began to realize that these men were not fighting for victory. They were fighting for meaning, for a final act, written in blood rather than forgotten words. One Imperial sergeant, years later, would recall it with haunted eyes. They kept coming. Even when they should have been dead, they kept coming. I thought I was fighting men, but it felt like we were fighting ghosts. By noon, Saigo's command post was a crater. The ridge burned under relentless shell fire. Beppu Shinsuke limped toward his leader, his left arm bound, his sword broken in half. "Takamori dono," he said, "it's over. The hill cannot hold." Saigo looked up at the sky, blue now, vast and indifferent. "Then it is time," he whispered. "Time for what?" He smiled faintly. "To return this borrowed life to its owner." A single tear rolled down Beppu's cheek. He understood, but before the ritual could begin, another explosion ripped through the ridge, hurling both men to the ground. The Imperial Army was advancing again, shouting, firing. Trampling through the smoke, Saigo rose slowly, blood soaking his robes. His sword was gone, buried in the mud. Around him, The last samurai were making their stand, shields of flesh and will against the unyielding tide. And then, from the haze, came a sound, the call of a conchorn. Deep, mournful, ancient. Every surviving samurai turned toward it, from the northern slope. A small group was descending, the remnants of another unit, carrying something wrapped in cloth. As they drew near, Beppu recognized it, the clan's ancestral banner. Saved from the academy in Kagoshima, the last emblem of the Satsuma spirit. They planted it on the ridge. The wind caught it. The black crest fluttered defiantly against the smoke-filled sky. Even the Imperial troops paused to look. For a heartbeat, the battlefield stilled, and in that silence, Saigō Takamori began to walk toward the Imperial line. He did not run, nor hide. He walked slowly, almost peacefully, his hand resting on the hilt of a side dagger. Bullets whipped past him, but none found their mark. Those who saw it later said it was as if the air itself refused to touch him. What happened next? The voice of history might murmur. No one truly knows. Some claim an officer tried to spare him. Others say he was struck by a bullet that shattered his hip. But the truth buried beneath the smoke is simpler and far more human. As he fell, Beppu Shinsuke reached him, kneeling beside his dying master. Saigo looked up, his breath shallow, and whispered, "Beppu, finish what must be done." The loyal friend nodded, tears cutting through the grime on his face. Moments later, a final cry echoed across Shiroyama, a sound of both death and deliverance. And just like that, the mountain fell silent again. But the battle was not yet over. Because as the Imperial troops climbed to claim the ridge, they found no surrender, only empty armor, broken blades, and men who had fought beyond death itself. Then someone noticed movement among the fallen. A shadow crawling toward the shattered banner. It was Beppu Shinsuke. He was still alive, and in his trembling hand, he held Saigo's blood-stained dagger. The blade glinted once in the sunlight, and what he did next would shake even the hearts of his enemies. The circle tightens. The smoke had begun to thin by afternoon, but the stench of gunpowder clung to the mountain like a ghost. Shiroyama was no longer a battlefield. It was a grave built on fire. Broken pines jutted from the earth like ribs. Armor fragments gleamed faintly in puddles of blood and rainwater. The cries of the wounded mingled with the low, rhythmic beat of the Imperial drums below. From among the bodies, Beppu Shinsuke dragged himself upright. His left arm hung useless, his face streaked with soot and grief. He stared at the dagger in his hand, Saigo's dagger, its blade slick with both loyalty and sorrow. Around him, what remained of the samurai moved like ghosts through the mist, tending to the fallen, whispering prayers to men who could no longer hear them. For the first time in his life, Beppu felt what Saigo had feared most, the silence after the storm. The Imperial troops had pulled back temporarily to regroup. Their commander, General Yamagata Aritomo, ordered a brief halt. Even he, the architect of modernization, could not deny what he had witnessed. The samurai had fought like legends out of time, and time itself seemed to hesitate before consuming them. But Beppu knew the reprieve would not last. As the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, Imperial engineers began their grim work, constructing new trenches, extending firing lines, hauling ammunition crates up the mountain. Every hammer strike echoed like a countdown. The ridge was shrinking, boxed in by the living and the dead alike. Beppu gathered the survivors, barely 200 men now. They sat among ruins, faces hollow, but eyes alight. Some were students from Satsuma Academy, barely 20 years old. Others were old retainers who had served under Saigo since the Restoration. Together they waited, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath with them. "Saigo Dano is gone," Beppu said quietly, his voice trembling but firm. "But his spirit has not left this ridge." We will not retreat. We will not surrender. We will remind the Empire what honor looks like, even if it no longer understands the word." The men nodded, their silence heavier than thunder. From the valley came a distant cheer. The Imperial soldiers had received news. The Emperor had declared victory. Kagoshima had fallen. But up on the ridge, no white flags rose. Instead, Beppu stood, gripping his broken sword, and turned toward the sea. The waves below caught the afternoon light, burning gold. For a moment, it looked like the horizon itself was on fire. He whispered, "Saigo Dono, if your soul watches us now, lend us your courage one last time." As night descended, the mountain grew colder. The Imperial Army surrounded Shiroyama completely, digging fresh trenches and setting searchlights. Their plan was simple: bombard the ridge until nothing living remained. The modern world had no room for relics, no patience for men who still believed that loyalty outweighed life. But the samurai did not wait for dawn. Shortly after midnight, Beppu ordered the remaining men to divide into 3 groups. Their task was not escape, it was remembrance. One group would guard the bodies of their fallen comrades. Another would burn the remaining banners to keep them from capture. And the last, led by Beppu himself, would strike into the enemy camp. A final flash of the old world before darkness swallowed it whole. They moved like shadows, silent and deliberate, slipping between burnt trees and shattered rock. The rain had stopped, leaving only the sound of boots in mud. Down below, Imperial sentries warmed their hands by the fire. Unaware that ghosts were already walking among them, the first gunshot shattered the stillness. Then another. Samurai stormed the outer trenches with short swords and bayonets stolen from fallen soldiers. Their war cries rolled down the slope, wild and desperate. For a moment, chaos returned, a storm reborn from ashes. Imperial soldiers stumbled awake, scrambling for rifles. Shouting orders lost beneath the sound of steel meeting steel. It was not a battle. It was a haunting Beppu, fought like a man who had already died once. His movements were precise, his face expressionless. He cut down one, then another, the blade in his good hand gleaming like lightning. The men around him followed. Some fell. Some rose again, but none turned back. By the time the Imperial reinforcements arrived, half of Beppu's men were gone. They fell back toward the ridge, carrying what remained of their wounded. The mission had failed, or so it seemed. But then one of the younger samurai stumbled forward, clutching something to his chest. It was a scroll, torn, scorched, but legible. He handed it to Beppu, gasping, "Found it." In the officer's tent, Beppu unrolled it under the dim moonlight. His breath caught. It was an order, signed by the Meiji government itself. The full text revealed what Saigo had suspected. The Emperor's army had been commanded not merely to suppress rebellion, but to annihilate the samurai class entirely. Every surviving warrior of Satsuma, even those far from the battlefield, was to be erased as a symbol of resistance. So that was the truth. Shiroyama wasn't just a battle, it was the execution of an idea. Beppu stared at the words until they blurred. Around him, the others waited in silence. Then he laughed, low, bitter, almost peaceful. "So this is it," he murmured. "This is what the new Japan demands, obedience without soul." One of the older men, his face lined with scars, spoke softly. "Then let our deaths be the last rebellion." Before dawn, Beppu ordered the last fires extinguished. They stacked their weapons, cleaned their blades, and tied white bands around their foreheads, the mark of those who had accepted death. No one spoke of escape anymore, only of dignity. As the horizon began to pale, a strange light fell over the ridge, a cold blue shimmer that turned the world into glass. The Imperial cannons adjusted once more, their barrels glinting like fangs in the dawn. Beppu took his place at the front, his men arrayed behind him in a silent line. He could feel the weight of their heartbeat, the pulse of a vanished age still beating beneath the earth. Down below, Giano Yamagata raised his hand. The signal to fire, and then a sound pierced the air. Not the roar of cannon, not the scream of battle, but music, a flute taut, faint, trembling, carried on the wind. One of the youngest samurai had begun to play an old melody from the Satsuma schools, a song once performed for victories, long forgotten. Its notes floated above the ridge, fragile yet unbroken. For a brief moment, even the imperial troops hesitated. Some lowered their rifles, unsure whether to shoot or listen. Then the cannon spoke. Fire rained upon the ridge. The mountain vanished beneath thunder. But through the smoke, the melody continued, and when the flames cleared, the ridge still stood, scarred, blackened, but alive. Beppu Shinsuke, his face lit by the firelight, raised his broken sword high. "They think they've won," he said softly. "Let them come and see what victory costs." Behind him, the surviving samurai tightened their ranks. The next assault was coming, and this time, the circle would close completely. The break in the line morning came like a blade drawn slow from its sheath. The ridge of Shiroyama was swallowed in mist again, its slopes slick with ash and rain. The Imperial Army, now numbering over 30,000, stood ready in 3 divisions, each facing a mountain that refused to fall. Drums thundered across the valley. Bugles screamed. The final assault had begun. Beppu Shinsuke watched from the crest, his breathing ragged, his arm bound in bloodied cloth. Around him stood fewer than 100 men. Each face was pale, but the eyes still burned with that quiet, impossible fire that no empire could extinguish. The cannons opened first, then the rifles. Then the mountain answered. The samurai rushed downhill into a storm of iron, screaming their last cry of defiance. The air split with the sound of bullets tearing through the rain like metal locusts. Bodies fell, smoke rose, but the charge did not stop. It only grew faster, louder, more furious. An imperial captain shouted for his men to hold formation, but the line trembled. When the first wave of samurai hit, the clash was like thunder cracking the earth in two. Blades flashed between gunfire. Bayonets tangled with katanas in violent intimacy. Mud, blood, and steel became one. And then, something no one expected. A gap opened. A section of the imperial flank, overconfident and misaligned, faltered under the weight of the charge. Beppu saw it instantly. Through the smoke, through the screams, he saw it like a doorway in hell. He turned to the few still standing. There, that's the crack in the dragon's scales. And with a cry, he led them in. They plunged through the breach, cutting a path into the enemy ranks. The samurai moved like a storm, unbound, swift, precise, unstoppable. For a few minutes, time seemed to fracture. Muskets jammed, soldiers stumbled. The imperial drums faltered mid-beat. The tide turned, but fate is a cruel observer because the gap was a trap of its own making. The moment the samurai broke through, imperial reserves surged in from both sides. A pincer of rifles and bayonets closed around. Beppu's charged like a fist. The realization hit him too late. Shots rang out in all directions. One of his men spun backward, a bullet through his chest. Another fell, clutching his sword arm. Beppu ducked low, slashing upward, feeling his blade strike true only for it to shatter on a rifle butt. Still, he fought. Still, they fought. Every step was agony, every breath a victory. They pushed through the trap one heartbeat at a time until the ground beneath them was slick with the past. The imperial soldiers, exhausted and bleeding, began to see the madness in their opponents' eyes. Not despair, not rage, but purpose. Why won't they die? One whispered because he didn't know these men had already died the moment they chose to stand on Shiroyama. Everything since then was grace. Beppu's sword gone, he picked up a fallen rifle, firing once, twice, before swinging it like a club. When it splintered, he used the bayonet. When the bayonet snapped, he used his fists. And when at last he fell to his knees, surrounded by the dead, he looked up at the sky and laughed a raw, broken sound that echoed between the cliffs. This is what they call peace. Then came the twist. Through the smoke, a sudden silence rolled across the field. Even the guns seemed to hesitate. A white flag appeared, not from the samurai, but from within the imperial lines themselves. Confusion rippled through the ranks. A messenger on horseback galloped forward, shouting frantically. The imperial commander, General Yamagata, lowered his spyglass and frowned. It wasn't a surrender. It was a warning. Behind the ridge, another explosion tore through the forest. Ammunition wagons Imperial. Wagons erupted in flames. A misfire or sabotage, no one could tell. But the blast ignited a chain of chaos that tore through the lower camps, setting fire to their own trenches for one strange, fleeting moment. It looked as though the samurai had drawn the heavens themselves into their side. The fire spread fast. Soldiers abandoned posts to drag wounded comrades away from the inferno. Cannons ceased their bombardment. Communication broke. The entire imperial line trembled under its own confusion. Beppu saw it and understood. The gods had given them one last heartbeat of power. Now, he roared. While the fire blinds them, he rallied whoever still breathed, charging not toward safety, but deeper into the chaos. They struck through the burning trenches, turning the imperial misfortune into one last surge of defiance. The flames reflected off their armor, painting them in gold and crimson, men made of myth. Rising from their own ashes, they reached the edge of the ridge again, cutting through the disoriented ranks until the world became nothing but red and smoke. For every step forward, a man fell. For every cry of victory, two silenced screams followed. Beppu's lungs burned, his vision blurred. But he kept moving until suddenly, a shot rang close. His leg buckled. He stumbled, collapsing beside the smoldering remains of a cannon wheel. The air was thick with heat and ash. Through the haze, he saw the imperial banner rising again. The enemy had regrouped. The break in the line had closed. Beppu dragged himself up on one knee. His voice came out hoarse but steady. Then this. This is how we end. He looked back up the slope to where the last of his brothers stood, silhouetted against the firestorm. Their blades were gone, their armor torn, but still they stood Saigo Dano. He whispered, "We did not yield." And somewhere above the roar of the flames, he thought he heard its Saigo's voice. Or perhaps only the wind. "You kept the promise." Beppu smiled faintly. His strength was gone, but peace was finally near. Below, the imperial forces began to climb once more, their path lit by the glow of their own burning camp. The battle was ending. But something in the air had changed. The emperor's soldiers moved slower now, as if burdened by the weight of what they had done. The modern world had won, but victory tasted like ashdot when dawn finally broke again over Shiroyama. No sound remained except the whisper of wind through smoke. The imperial flag fluttered at half-mast, and there, at the summit, a single tattered banner still swayed in defiance, the crest of Satsuma. Black against the rising sun, it was said that even the emperor wept when he heard how they died. But the story was not finished. Because in the ashes of that mountain, something survived, not bodies, not swords, an idea, one that would outlive every empire that claimed to bury it. And as the imperial troops began their search among the fallen, one soldier froze. He had found a sealed letter hidden beneath a blood-stained cloak. The wax bore Saigo. Takamori's mark. He broke the seal and his hands began to tremble, because inside that letter was a secret that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about Shiroyama, and about the man the world called the last samurai. After the thunder, the battlefield was quiet at last. Not silent, no. Silence was too merciful for such a place, but quiet. In that haunting way, the earth grows still after it has finished, remembering the screams. The ridge of Shiroyama lay in ruin, blackened and broken, the smoke rising in lazy ribbons toward a sky that could not decide whether to rain or forgive. The sun crept higher, washing the mountain in a pale, colorless light. Where once stood warriors, there were now only shapes' bodies half buried in ash, armor melted into the soil. The air tasted of iron and sorrow. An imperial detachment moved carefully through the wreckage, boots sinking into mud that had once been men. Their faces were pale, their rifles lowered. There was no pride in victory, only exhaustion. One soldier, barely 20, knelt beside a fallen samurai. The man's armor was split, but his grip still locked around his sword, his expression calm, almost noble. The young soldier hesitated, then whispered a bow of respect before moving on. At the summit, General Yamagata stood alone. He surveyed what was left the ridge that had resisted his guns for 2 full days. The last men of an era who had refused to kneel. He had won. Yet the triumph tasted like blood in his mouth. An aide approached, clutching something wrapped in cloth. "Sir, this was found near the command trench. It bears Saigō Takamori's seal." Yamagata took it carefully. The cloth was stiff with dried blood. Inside lay a letter, folded twice, sealed with red wax, and stamped with Saigo's crest. The paper trembled slightly in his hand as he broke the seal and began to read. The handwriting was steady, elegant strokes, formed by a man at peace with what awaited him. To the men of the new age. You have fought bravely for your emperor, and for that I hold no hatred. I, too, once served the same throne. But remember, this what is strength without honor? What is progress without heart? The rifle and the sword may differ in shape, but both draw blood the same. When a nation forgets its soul, it wins battles and loses itself. The samurai die today, not in rebellion, but in witness. Yamagata lowered the page, his jaw tightening. Around him, the soldiers shifted uneasily, sensing the weight of the words even without hearing them. He read on. "Do not pity us. We are the shadow of what you will one day become, a mirror of the pride you will forget, the loyalty you will trade for comfort. When the empire grows strong, remember Shiroyama. Remember that we stood not against you, but before you, showing you the cost of what you now inherit." The last line was short, almost tender. "Tell His Majesty, I die grateful that Japan has awakened. I only pray it remembers its dream." Yamagata folded the letter carefully, his eyes unreadable. For a moment, he looked not like a victor, but a mourner. Then he gave a quiet order. "Gather their bodies. Bury them as warriors." And so the imperial troops began their final duty, not as conquerors, but as witnesses. They dug shallow graves along the slope, marking each one with stones and twigs. The smell of incense rose from hastily lit offerings. The flames flickered against the wind, like tiny souls reluctant to leave. Among the fallen, they found Beppu Shinsuke still kneeling beside Saigo's body. One hand resting on his dagger, the other clutching the banner of Satsuma. His face was peaceful, his eyes half open, as if watching the dawn. When Yamagata saw him, he bowed slightly. "A loyal man," he murmured, "even in defeat." The ridge grew quiet again, broken only by the rustle of the sea breeze through the pines. From somewhere below, a fisherman's bell chimed faintly, carried up the slope on the morning wind, and then, like an echo of history, the clouds parted. Sunlight spilled over the ridge, catching the remnants of armor, turning them to gold for a brief, merciful heartbeat. It was as if the mountain itself wished to remember. But even as the last embers cooled, Japan moved on. Within weeks, the government declared the Satsuma Rebellion extinguished. The newspapers printed Saigo's name beside words like traitor and insurrectionist. Yet, in the streets of Kagoshima, people whispered another name, Shishi no Saigo, the Lion of the Samurai. The man who had fought not against the emperor, but against the forgetting of what it meant to be Japanese. Children would later climb Shiroyama slopes to pick wildflowers, never realizing they were stepping over the bones of the last warriors of the old age. Merchants passed through Kagoshima with new rifles, new uniforms, new futures. The sword became a relic. The code became a story. But stories are the most dangerous relics of all, because they endure where blood fades in time. The Meiji Emperor himself ordered Saigō Takamori's name cleared. He was pardoned posthumously, his rebellion recast as loyalty misunderstood. Statues were raised in his honor, one in Ueno Park, another in Kagoshima. They called him the last samurai, not as insult, but as remembrance. Yet there was one detail the history books never mentioned. When Saigo's body was recovered, something small was found tucked beneath his armor, a smooth, black stone, engraved with two characters, Shin and Gi, heart and righteousness. No one knew its origin. Some claimed it was a charm from his youth. Others believed it was cut from the same rock as the temples of Satsuma. But those who touched it swore they felt something, like the pulse of a nation that refused to forget its heartbeat. And here lies the twist history never told. That stone was never returned to the imperial treasury. It disappeared before the burial. Years later, rumors spread through the ports of Nagasaki of a sailor carrying a black charm said to protect him from bullets. He claimed it once belonged to a great general who died on a mountain of fire. Coincidence, perhaps? But legends have a way of surviving long after truth is buried. As twilight fell over Shiroyama once more, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it echoes of the past, the clang of steel, the roar of cannons, the final cry of men who refused to bow. And if you stood there long enough, eyes closed, heart still, you might almost hear them, the last samurai, charging once more through the mist, unbroken, unforgotten, because courage once born never truly dies. It only changes its armor, and so ended the Battle of Shiroyama. Not in defeat, but in remembrance. Not with silence, but with legacy. For on that blood-soaked ridge, the old Japan died, and the soul of the new one was born. The spirit that would not die decades past. And the mountain that once shook with thunder now stood silent green again, alive with wildflowers and cicadas. But beneath its roots, the echoes of Shiroyama still breathed. Travelers said that on stormy nights, lightning touched the ridge exactly where Saigo had fallen, as if heaven itself still saluted him. Japan had changed. Railways cut across fields where samurai once rode. Factories rose where shrines once stood. The emperor's vision had triumphed, an empire of steel, progress, and discipline. Yet behind the steel, a question lingered in every heart that dared to remember what had been lost to build it. In schools, teachers told the story of the Satsuma Rebellion as a cautionary tale. They spoke of modernization, of victory, of order restored. But in the homes of the old, the whispers were different. Grandfathers spoke softly of honor, of the men who fought against the inevitable, not to change it, but to remind it of its soul. And in those whispers, Saigō Takamori lived on, not as a rebel, not as a martyr, but as the conscience of a nation that had outgrown its reflection. In 1898, more than 20 years after the battle, the emperor himself, moved by guilt, perhaps, or by the burden of what Japan had become, declares Saigo's name restored. The man once branded traitor was now hero again. His statue was unveiled in Ueno Park, Tokyo. A bronze warrior, bareheaded, dressed in the simple robes of a man, not the armor of a general. Beside him, a faithful dog. The crowd that gathered that day was immense: farmers, veterans, children. Many had never seen Saigo, yet when they gazed upon the statue, they bowed in silence. For them, it was not bronze they sit, was memory. The mountain stood again, but history has a way of repeating itself, wearing new masks each time. In the decades that followed, Japan's hunger for greatness returned, this time wrapped in flags and fire. The spirit of the samurai was called upon once more, twisted into new wars, new conquests. The very ideals that Saigo had tried to protect, honor, loyalty, sacrifice, were used again. But without the mercy that once gave them meaning, when Tokyo burned under the bombs of a different century. Survivors whispered the same question Saigo once asked beneath the rain: what is strength without honor? And in that question, his ghost lingered. Even today, if you walk through Kagoshima at dusk, the locals will tell you the air feels heavier near Shiroyama. The wind carries the faint scent of gunpowder and pine. They'll say that if you close your eyes at the right moment, you can hear horses galloping through the mist tubes that no longer exist. Voices shouting in a language of courage that the world has almost forgotten. But perhaps it is not ghosts at all. Perhaps it is memory itself, refusing to die. Because the Battle of Shiroyama was never about rifles or swords. It was about something far deeper: the struggle between progress and identity, between the living and their history. And every nation, in its own time, faces that same war. Saigō Takamori's final words, written on that mountain, were never meant only for Japan. They were meant for all who build new worlds from the bones of the old. Do not forget where you began. The blade dulls, but the spirit endures. The camera of memory pans upward the ridge of Shiroyama, glowing under a golden sun. The banners are gone, but the wind still moves as if they were there. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmurs across the sea, soft and low, like an old warrior remembering his name. And then, silence, until a voice, low and calm, breaks through the quiet. They didn't fight for glory. They fought because they had no choice. That is where history ends, legend begins. So if this story found you tonight, remember the men who chose honor over survival, who faced the future unarmed yet unbroken. For in every act of courage, in every refusal to bow to what is easy, their spirit lives again. The spirit that would not die. The soul that still burns beneath the armor of time. The last stand that made a nation remember what it means to be human. And so, on that blood-soaked hill where thunder met steel and history wept, the samurai fell, but Japan stood taller.